In the summer of 1947, a reconnaissance pilot named Earl Dathan Voss flew a routine patrol over the high desert outside Roswell, New Mexico, and never spoke about what happened that night for 46 years. Then, dying of congestive heart failure in a small house outside Amarillo, Texas, he agreed to sit for one recorded conversation. He said there was no point taking it with him. What he described in that conversation has never been made public until now, and I want to say clearly before we go any further that this account comes from a single elderly source, decades after the fact, and should be treated as exactly that. A story someone told, not a verified record. Voss was 26 years old in July of 1947, a first lieutenant flying weather reconnaissance out of a small satellite airstrip roughly 40 miles from the main base. His job was unglamorous. He flew a fixed loop 3 times a week, logged cloud cover and wind patterns, and came home. On the night of July 5th, according to his own account, that loop was interrupted by a radio transmission that didn't match any frequency he recognized as standard, instructing him to divert to a coordinate he'd never been given before. He almost didn't comply. That's the detail he kept returning to, decades later, sitting in that chair with an oxygen line under his nose. He almost radioed back and refused. He said something about that transmission felt wrong before he understood why. A kind of static underneath the voice that he could never afterward describe to anyone's satisfaction. But he was young, and he was obedient in the specific way young officers are obedient, and so he turned the aircraft and flew toward a set of coordinates that led him to a stretch of flat scrubland he didn't recognize, lit at one end by a cluster of vehicle headlights arranged in a rough semicircle. He landed on a strip that had clearly been improvised that same night. Packed earth marked with flares rather than proper runway lighting. Before his propeller had fully stopped, a man in an unmarked jacket was already at the cockpit door. This is where the official record, to the degree any official record touches this story at all, goes quiet. There is no flight log entry for Voss's aircraft on the night of July 5th that reflects a diversion. There is a maintenance note, brief and unremarkable, indicating the aircraft was serviced the following morning for what it calls minor instrument drift. That's the entire paper trail, as far as anyone has been able to determine. A single vague sentence standing in for whatever actually happened that night. Voss was walked, not driven. Roughly a quarter mile to a tent structure erected at the edge of the scrubland, canvas walls, portable lighting strung from a center pole. He said the first thing he noticed wasn't visual at all. It was the quiet. Not silence exactly, he was careful about that word, but a kind of quiet that felt deliberate, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it is trying not to make a sound. There were perhaps 6 other people inside when he entered. He never learned most of their names. One man in a lab coat that looked out of place in a field tent. 2 others in uniform whose insignia he didn't recognize and later concluded, after years of thinking about it, weren't standard Army Air Forces at all. And at the center of the tent, seated in what he described as an ordinary folding chair, the kind you'd find in any mess hall, was something that was not a person. I want to slow down here, because Voss himself slowed down here, in the recording, more than at any other point in 4 hours of conversation. He said the first thing he registered wasn't the shape of it or the size of it. It was that it was breathing. That's the word he used, breathing, and he stopped for a moment after he said it, as though surprised at himself for saying it that plainly. He said there was a rhythm to it, slow, almost exaggerated, like something being done consciously rather than automatically. He said watching it breathe was the moment the whole situation stopped feeling like a briefing and started feeling like a room with another person in it. It was small, he said, smaller than he expected. Though he was quick to add that he hadn't expected anything specific, hadn't had time to build expectations. He estimated 4 feet, maybe slightly less. Its skin had a texture he compared, hesitantly, to the underside of a leaf, something faintly matte, faintly gray-green rather than the flat gray he'd later hear described in other stories, in other decades, by other people. Its eyes were dark and larger than proportion would suggest they should be, though he said the word large undersold it. He said the actual effect wasn't size. It was depth. He said looking at them felt like looking into water where you can't find the bottom. Nobody had told him what to do. That was the detail that seemed to trouble him most, even 46 years later. He hadn't been briefed. He hadn't been prepared. He was simply brought into a tent and left standing near the entrance while the men in unfamiliar insignia conferred quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward him, occasionally glancing toward the being in the chair as though waiting to see what would happen. What happened, according to Voss, was that it looked at him, not glanced, not registered his presence the way you might register a person entering a room. He was specific about this, correcting himself twice in the recording until he found language he was satisfied with. It turned its head, he said, the way a person turns toward a sound they've been listening for. Not surprised. Expecting one of the men in the unfamiliar uniform, the one Voss believed held some kind of authority in that tent, approached him and said only this: "It responds to you. Go closer." Voss asked why. He never received an answer. He said the man simply looked at him until he understood the question wasn't going to be addressed a second time, and so he walked forward. This is the section of the recording where the interviewer, an oral historian who had spent years collecting testimony of this kind and who I am declining to name at his own request, stopped asking questions entirely. He told me later, in a separate conversation, that he made a deliberate choice in that moment to let the silence run, because every time he'd interrupted Voss earlier in the conversation, something in the momentum of the memory seemed to break. So for nearly 90 seconds on the tape, there is nothing but the sound of Voss breathing. And then he continues. He said he crouched down until he was roughly at eye level, an instinct he couldn't fully explain, something closer to what you'd do approaching a frightened animal than what you'd do approaching a stranger. And the being extended one hand, slowly, palm slightly upward, an emotion, he said, felt less like a greeting and more like an offering, though he was careful. Again, to say he wasn't certain that was the right word either. It had 4 fingers, longer than his, thinner, and cooler than he expected to the touch. Not cold exactly, but cooler than skin should be. He held its hand for what he estimated, though he acknowledged this estimate was unreliable, somewhere between 2 and 4 minutes. And then, he said, something happened that he has never found adequate language for in 46 years of occasionally trying. Not words. Not pictures exactly, though pictures is the closest word he has. He described a sensation of understanding something all at once, the way you might suddenly understand the ending of a story you'd been reading for a very long time. Except he couldn't say afterward what the story had been about. He said the feeling that stayed with him longest wasn't information. It was recognition. He used that word 3 separate times across the 4 hours, unprompted each time. Recognition, as though something in the room had been looking for him specifically and had, in that moment, found what it was looking for. He was pulled away after that, not roughly, but firmly, by one of the men who'd been standing near the tent's entrance. He said the being's hand released his without resistance, and that the last thing he registered before being walked back out into the dark was the being watching him leave, its head turned to follow him the entire distance to the flap of the tent. He flew back to his airstrip before dawn. He was met on the tarmac by an officer he did recognize, someone from his own unit, who told him only that his aircraft had experienced instrument trouble that night and that he was not to discuss the diversion with anyone, including other pilots in his squadron. He was told this once, flatly, without room for questions, and he said he understood immediately that it wasn't really a request. Before we get to what came after, there's a detail Voss returned to more than once, almost as an aside, that I think matters more than he seemed to realize. He said that at some point while he was still standing near the tent's entrance. Before anyone had told him to approach, he overheard part of a conversation between the man in the lab coat and one of the officers in the unfamiliar uniform. He didn't catch all of it. He caught a fragment. Something about response consistency, and a phrase he remembered clearly because it struck him as strange, even in the moment. Not the first one we've tried. He said he didn't think much of it that night. He was 26, frightened and trying not to look frightened in front of men who outranked him in a way he didn't fully understand. But he said that phrase stayed lodged in his memory for the rest of his life, because it implied something he never had confirmed and never stopped wondering about. That he wasn't the only person who had been brought into that tent, that there had been others before him, and that whatever was happening in that room was less a spontaneous event than a kind of test being run, quietly, on more than one subject, to see who or what would produce a result. He never learned what happened to whoever came before him. He never learned if there was anyone after. He said that not knowing was, in some ways, worse than anything he'd actually witnessed, because it meant the story he was carrying wasn't really his own story at all. It was a fragment of something larger, something with an architecture he was never allowed to see, and he spent decades turning that single overheard phrase over in his mind, trying to decide what it meant and never arriving anywhere solid. Here is where the story, if it is a story, becomes genuinely difficult to hold on to, because what follows in Voss's account is less a sequence of events than an absence of them. He was transferred within 3 weeks to a training command post in the Midwest, a transfer he described as unusually fast for a lateral move with no apparent operational justification. He never flew reconnaissance again. He never returned to New Mexico. He said that for years afterward, he assumed someone was still watching to make sure he stayed quiet, though he had no direct evidence of that beyond a persistent, low-grade unease he was never able to shake, and never fully explained to his wife, who he married in 1951, and who, he said, sensed there was something he was carrying, but never asked what it was. What makes an account like this difficult to simply dismiss and equally difficult to simply accept is the specificity of small, seemingly unimportant details that don't obviously serve a dramatic purpose. Voss didn't describe a spacecraft in detail. He didn't describe advanced technology, weapons, or any of the imagery that had, by the time he gave this interview in the early 1990s, become the standard vocabulary of stories like this one. He talked about a folding chair. He talked about the sound of the being breathing. He talked about the temperature of its hand. These are not the details of someone building a myth. They're the details, or so the argument goes, of someone straining to remember something specific and mundane inside an experience that otherwise defies memory entirely. And yet none of it is verifiable. There is no flight log that confirms the diversion. There is no personnel record indicating an unusual transfer. Only the ordinary movement of a junior officer through a career that, on paper, looks unremarkable in every way. The tent, the coordinates, the men in unfamiliar insignia, all of it exists only in one recorded conversation, made near the end of one man's life and passed along by people who believed it deserved to be heard rather than lost. Voss's daughter, contacted years later by the same oral historian who conducted the original interview, said she remembered almost nothing unusual about her father's demeanor growing up, with one exception. Every year, without fail on the 5th of July, he would go quiet for the entire day. Not sullen, she said, not withdrawn in a way that alarmed anyone, just quiet, distracted, present, but somewhere else. She said she asked him about it exactly once, as a teenager, And he told her it was nothing, an old anniversary he didn't like talking about, and she never asked again. She said it wasn't until she was well into adulthood, going through his things after he died, that she found a single index card tucked into an old flight manual, on which he had written, in pencil, a string of numbers that resembled coordinates, and beneath them 3 words, "Still don't know." She said she has kept that card. She has never been able to determine what the coordinates correspond to, and every attempt to cross-reference them against known airbase locations from the period has come back inconclusive. This is, admittedly, a small and unverifiable detail layered on top of an already unverifiable account, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend it functions as proof of anything. But there is something in the specificity of it. An index card, 3 pencil words, an anniversary observed silently for over 4 decades that resists the easy explanation of a story invented for attention or profit. Men who fabricate encounters for public consumption tend to build outward, toward drama, toward larger claims. They rarely build inward, toward a private ritual of silence that no one but a daughter ever noticed, and that produced no benefit to Voss at all beyond a lifetime of carrying something alone. Voss himself seemed aware of this problem. At one point in the recording, he says, almost apologetically, that he knows how it sounds. He says he spent years telling himself he'd misremembered it, that stress or fatigue or the strange disorientation of night flying had produced something his mind later smoothed into a coherent story. He says he wanted for a long time to believe that. He says it would have been easier, but he also says this, near the end of the recording, in a voice noticeably quieter than the rest of the interview, that whatever happened in that tent, the thing he cannot explain away, the thing that stress and fatigue and imagination don't account for, is the recognition. He says a hallucination doesn't recognize you back. He says whatever was sitting in that chair knew, somehow, that he was the one it needed to reach, and that in 46 years he has never stopped wondering what it was that passed between them in those 2 or 4 minutes, what understanding was offered and how much of it he failed to receive, how much of it simply didn't survive the translation into a mind that wasn't built to hold it. He died 11 months after giving that interview. The tape, along with several others collected over the same period, remains in private hands, shared carefully among a small circle of researchers who, by their own account, are less interested in proving anything than in making sure these stories aren't lost entirely when the people who live them die. There's one more piece of this worth sitting with before we get to the end, because it's the part Voss himself circled back to most insistently, almost stubbornly, whenever the interviewer tried to move the conversation forward. He wanted to know why. Not why the encounter happened at all. He said he'd made a kind of peace with never answering that question. But why him specifically? Why a 26-year-old weather pilot with no scientific training, no security clearance beyond the routine, no distinguishing qualities that he could identify in himself worth singling out? He said he asked one of the men in the tent that exact question, directly, before he was walked back out to his aircraft, and the man had looked at him for a long moment and said only that some people respond and some people don't, and that it wasn't something they had figured out how to predict in advance. Voss said that answer bothered him more than almost anything else about that night, because it meant the entire encounter, the recognition, the sense of being specifically found, might have had nothing to do with who he was at all. It might have been closer to chance, a kind of matching that had less to do with Earl Voss, the person, and more to do with some quality he possessed without knowing it, the way a key fits a lock without either one understanding the mechanism between them. So what do we do with Earl Voss? An old man, alone, near the end of his life, describing a folding chair in a tent in the desert, and a hand that was cooler than it should have been. We can set it aside as the understandable invention of a tired mind reaching for meaning at the end of a long, ordinary life. That option is always there, and for some people it will always be the more comfortable one. But if even part of it is true, if there really was a night in July of 1947 when a junior reconnaissance pilot was pulled out of the sky and walked into a tent to sit across from something that had apparently been waiting, specifically for someone like him, then the real question isn't whether the story is real. It's what was being offered in that exchange, and whether anyone else, on any other night, in any other tent, might have been offered the same thing and understood it and simply never told anyone at all. Voss said the recognition never left him. He said it was the last thing he thought about most nights, even 50 years later, even lying in a hospital bed with an oxygen line under his nose. Whatever passed between his hand and that cooler, longer hand in 1947 didn't fade the way memories are supposed to fade. If anything, he said, it got louder as everything else in his life got quieter. What was it trying to give him? What was he supposed to understand, and how much of it slipped away in the translation? And if there were others, other Earl Vosses. Standing at the edge of other tents on other nights, not the first one we've tried, did any of them manage to hold on to more than he did? Did any of them find the words he never found? Or did the words simply die with them too? Quietly, in bedrooms and hospital rooms across the country, unrecorded, unheard, indistinguishable from the ordinary silence of an old man thinking about something he can't share. Or is what's left of all of it now nothing but a handful of recordings, a handful of old men speaking quietly near the end of their lives, describing a hand extended in the dark and a question none of them ever got to finish answering, a pencil note on an index card, a single day a year when a father went quiet and never said why. Whatever passed between Earl Voss and whatever was sitting in that folding chair in July of 1947, it seems to have outlasted him. It's still here, somewhere, in the gap between what he understood and what he could say, waiting, the way he said it was waiting, for someone else to reach back.